right, welcome back to Vuln Vibes, everybody. For today's deep dive, we're heading back into the WP Safe block, where we take a look at the latest WordPress vulnerabilities that security pros like yourselves need to know about. So we've got a really interesting batch of vulnerabilities to go over today.
Yeah, this is a pretty fascinating set.
I think the thing that jumps out at me is how seemingly mundane features and kind of basic website components are becoming attack vectors.
You know, we always hear about the big scary 0 days and the really advanced persistent threats and everything, but sometimes it's the everyday things that we just overlook.
That's right. So let's jump right in. First up, we have the Linux Elementor Leads add-on. And this one's got a stored cross-site scripting, XSS vulnerability.
Oh, stored XSS. That's always fun.
Right. And what's kind of interesting about this one is that it's exploiting something as simple as a URL form field, which, on the surface, it's like, okay, how dangerous can a URL form field be?
You know, a lot of times developers might assume there's no real risk in a simple URL field, and so they don't implement as robust input sanitization and output escaping.
Yeah.
As they should. And so attackers can take advantage of that to inject malicious scripts into these fields, potentially hijacking user sessions, redirecting users to phishing sites.
Yeah.
And the thing about stored XSS is that once that script is stored, it's there. It's not just a one-time thing. Anyone who visits that page is potentially vulnerable.
It becomes a persistent threat.
Exactly.
So let's move on to something that sounds a little bit more innocuous at first glance. This is the WooCommerce Food plugin.
Okay.
And this one's got an arbitrary shortcode execution vulnerability.
Ooh, that sounds tasty.
I know, right? Like, how could, ordering a pizza lead to a website takeover, but.
Well, I'll tell you, it all comes down to this function called do shortcode. And if a plugin uses this function without proper validation, attackers can essentially just embed malicious code within shortcodes.
Right.
And when certain actions are triggered, like placing that pizza order, that malicious code gets executed.
So they're giving you the keys to the castle.
Essentially.
Just because you asked for extra pepperoni.
Yeah, and this is actually a growing trend we're seeing where plugins are adding all sorts of cool features and functionality, but they're not really thinking about the security implications and how those features could be abused.
It's like they're building a house with unlocked doors and windows.
Exactly.
All right, let's take a trip down memory lane here to something a little bit more classic. This is the LTL Fright Quotes plugin.
Okay, I'm familiar with that one.
And this one has a SQL injection, SQLi vulnerability.
Ah, the good old SQLi classic.
Right, I know SQLi has been around forever, but this one stood out to me because it's specifically targeting AJAX endpoints.
Yeah, and those AJAX endpoints often handle data kind of in the background.
Right.
So vulnerabilities there can be a little bit sneaky. They might not be immediately obvious. But when you combine that with insufficient escaping and poorly constructed queries, it can be a real problem.
Right.
Attackers can manipulate user input, they can extract sensitive data, modify orders, potentially even take control of the entire database.
And especially with a shipping and logistics plugin, you're dealing with customer addresses, you're dealing with potentially payment information, tracking numbers.
Right. It's a treasure trove of valuable information for an attacker.
This isn't just website defacement. This is identity theft, financial fraud.
Exactly. The stakes are high.
Yeah, so next up, we've got an open redirect vulnerability in the wpmobile.app plugin.
Okay.
And I feel like everyone can kind of visualize how this works. You click on a link to download an app, and instead of going to the App Store, you end up on some phishing site.
Right, and that's the danger of these open redirects. They exploit the trust that users have in a website. So even if that initial URL looks completely legitimate, the redirect can send them somewhere malicious without them even realizing it.
Right, and, we all think we're security savvy, but a really well-crafted phishing site can fool even the best of us.
It happens to the best of us, yeah.
Okay, so this next one's a little bit more technical.
Right, let's get into the weeds.
This is the Ravage plugin.
Okay.
And this one has a PHP object injection vulnerability.
Ooh, object injection, that's a good one.
It sounds kind of like a Trojan horse, right?
It is, in a way. So it involves injecting serialized objects that on the surface might seem harmless, but under the right conditions, those objects can actually manipulate the application state.
Right.
And that can lead to things like code execution. And here's where it gets really interesting. To fully exploit this, attackers often need what's called a pop chain.
A pop chain.
Yeah, it stands for property-oriented programming, and essentially it's a series of vulnerabilities in different plugins that, when chained together, allow the attacker to gain full control.
So it's kind of like a domino effect. One vulnerability triggers another, and it can lead to a much bigger problem.
Exactly. One vulnerability on its own might not be that serious, but when you start chaining them together, that's when things can get really bad.
Okay, last but not least, we have the Ultimate Classified Listings plugin. And this one's got a cross-site request orgery, CSRF vulnerability.
CSRF, another class.
I know, right? Now, CSRF might seem like a less severe threat. but it can still have some serious consequences.
Oh, absolutely.
Imagine an attacker silently changing a user's email address or hijacking their entire account without them even noticing.
That's the thing about CSRF. It really preys on that trust that users have in the websites they visit.
Right.
So by tricking a user into submitting a malicious request, an attacker can perform actions on their behalf without their knowledge or consent.
And the user might not even realize what's happening.
Exactly. It can be very stealthy.
So is there anything that developers can do to protect against this?
Absolutely. Proper nonce validation is key here. So a nonce is essentially a unique token that's generated for each request, and it helps verify that the request is actually coming from the user and not from an attacker.
So it's kind of like a security handshake
Exactly.
to make sure that the request is legitimate.
Yeah, it's a simple but effective way to prevent CSRF attacks.
So, we've covered a lot of ground here. What do you think is the key takeaway for our listeners today?
I think the biggest thing is just to remember that website security is all interconnected. These vulnerabilities might seem isolated, but they really highlight the need for a holistic approach.
Right.
We need to move beyond just patching individual vulnerabilities and start thinking about how attackers can chain these exploits together to achieve their goals.
It's not just about fixing one thing. It's about understanding the whole ecosystem
E-
and how all these different pieces can fit together. So for all of you listening out there, I encourage you to share your own thoughts, your experiences with these vulnerabilities. Let's learn from each other and collectively raise the bar for WordPress security.
Right. The more we share and collaborate, the better prepared we'll all be.
And as we, navigate this ever-evolving threat landscape, I think it's important to remember that the seemingly mundane can be just as dangerous as the highly publicized zero-day exploits.
It's easy to get caught up in the hype of the latest and greatest attacks, but sometimes it's the simple things that can really trip us up.
So stay vigilant, stay informed, and stay ahead of the game.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us for another deep dive into the world of WordPress vulnerabilities.
It's always a pleasure to be here.
Until next time, stay safe out there.